Hi everyone, this is the first part for the week on Leibniz's monadology, as well as the dialogue about between Filarete and Aristide. And for the first part, I would like to present some of Leibniz's arguments against the Cartesian notion of bodies as extended substances. So you'll recall in Descartes, there are two fundamentally different kinds of substances, minds and bodies, and they differ because bodies have extension, they exist in space, whereas minds are incorporeal, right? And the very fact that we can imagine them as being distinct means for Descartes that they are two fundamentally different substances. Descartes then, uses this argument throughout his entire philosophy in some very important ways. So, in this class, I want to explain some, not all, but some of Leibniz's arguments against this Cartesian notion of bodies, and especially against interactionism. And Descartes' conception of the mind as a substance and extension as another substance, and then they enter into some sort of interaction with each other. And so for this video, I'm going to point out three problems that Leibniz brings up with Descartes. The first is the problem of composition, the second is the problem of continuity, and then the third is the problem of conservation. So the first problem, the problem of composition, this is a very interesting and neat argument. It really comes out in the conversation between Filarete and Aristide, which is why I had to add it to the readings for this week. Leibniz basically says, okay, so speaking as Filarete, he says, okay, Descartes, you say that substances are defined by having a kind of independence. And that's why the fact that we can conceive of the properties of a body independently that we can conceive of the properties of the mind demonstrates that they're two different substances. Then Aristide says, yes, that's right. And then Leibniz cites that passage, or at least refers to that passage that we read from the Principles of Philosophy, where Descartes' like, well, if I'm being strict about how I'm speaking, then God is really the only substance, since everything is ultimately dependent on God. So then Aristide goes, okay, let's try to fix Descartes' notion of substance so that we can say that finite minds and extended things are substances by saying that substances are things that exert a relative kind of independence among created things, right? And so here, Aristide tries to hold on to the idea that this pen is a substance, right? Or this pencil is a substance and it differs from this pen, right? And they're both substances because they're both independent of each other. They encounter modifications independently of one another, and so on, right? That's basically Descartes' argument for why we should conceive of them as independent substances. Okay, so now the problem of composition. So in this case, we can take up, Descartes' example of the candle, right? And the candle and its wax, right? And Descartes says, oh, we can conceive of the candle as a substance because it's what remains the same throughout all the modifications of the candle. So if you leave the candle, on overnight, then the wax, is going to lose its shape, it's going to change its smell, it's going to change all of its sensible qualities, right? But Descartes says, okay, but the thing that doesn't change is that the wax takes up space, and that's what ultimately makes it a substance. That's why we're able to mark that out as the essential part of that substance. Now, Leibniz's argument is, okay, so your argument depends on the notion that the extended substance of the candle is independent of other extended substances. What about the atoms that compose the candle? This is a really big problem, right? Because the candle is definitely not independent of the atoms that compose the candle, right? In fact, without those atoms, the candle wouldn't take up any space at all, right? So what Leibniz's conclusion from this is that, hey, bodies cannot be a substance because they're actually an aggregate. They're a grouping, of all of these various atoms, right? And as an aggregate, the parts can go in and out, right? The parts can be replaced, and in fact often are replaced, right? So it's not really a substance in that it's not independent of other created things because it's composed of other created things. So for Leibniz, bodies are aggregates. They're not substances. And to say that they're an aggregate is to say that their being depends on the things that they are composed of, in this case, the atoms. And for Leibniz, the problem is even deeper because it turns out that even the individual atoms that you want to think of as a body, these are themselves composed of further bodies. In this case, we would say, subatomic particles and so on. And Leibniz believes that even though we currently do not have the power to maybe understand what subatomic particles are composed of, Descartes' very conception of space requires the divisibility of everything within space, right? Because things that are in space take up space. But that's a quantifiable amount, right? And so you can always divide further and further and further. Some philosophers are atomists, and what that means is that they theorize that there is a smallest possible part of matter. However, Leibniz argues that atomism is actually incompatible with our modern understanding of space. Namely, that if space is extension, and extension is something mathematically quantifiable, then we always have the possibility of dividing it further and further. And so this is related to the second problem, the problem of continuity. So we can think of, in many ways, this number line as a metaphor for what a body is. So I'm going to write here, it's like a body. The reason why it's a body is because it's an aggregate, right? In this case, we're drawing a number line between the integers 0 and 1, right? And it turns out that just as a body is infinitely divisible, a number line is infinitely divisible, right? So there are an infinite number of numbers between 0 and 1, and just as a quick demonstration of this, consider 0.5 and 0.6. These are two numbers between 0 and 1. You can then draw a further number line where you're drawing the number line from 0.5 to 0.6, and then you can do 0.55 and 0.56. And then you can, we'll draw this one blue so that, you can see that then this is the basis of an even further number line, right? That's 0.55 and 0.56. And you can discover the middle of that, which is 0.555, and then 0.556, and so on, right? And so for Leibniz, what the principle of sufficient reason means is that you need to have some sort of reason or justification for why we could halt this problem at any one of its iterations. And it turns out that we don't really have any basis for doing that, either within the physical worlds of bodies or in the mathematical way that we theorize bodies. We might reach a point where we and our human powers can sort of divide no further, right? But because bodies reflect mathematical qualities about space, we always have the possibility of dividing further and further and further. And so what this means is that all bodies are always aggregates, right? They're composed of individual points that themselves have no magnitude. The individual points that constitute this number line cannot themselves have a magnitude because they are infinitely divisible, right? And so here we get into an idea of Leibniz, which is just that points are like infinitesimally small magnitudes or quantities. And ultimately, this is what monads are, right? Monads are simple substances. They are living force within creatures. They're like a sort of organizing principle. And Leibniz believes that within every body, there is an infinite number of monads. So that might sound at once like sort of implausible, but also very confusing. But this is in fact what Leibniz means. And part of his motivation was he was very impressed with the microscope. He saw that whenever we looked at basically anywhere in a microscope, that we saw a number of microorganisms, right? And Leibniz theorized that these microorganisms, and in fact further microorganisms that are even smaller than the bacteria, viruses, cells, and so on, that we can come to know and understand that there's even further smaller and smaller microorganisms, and so on. And so every body is just an aggregate of these monads, right? And so in the same way, what Leibniz wants to say about the candle, about bodies, is that bodies are phenomenal. That's not to say that bodies are, I'm not like celebrating bodies, but what Leibniz means by phenomenal is that he means that they're only appearances, right? So like it seems like there's a relative kind of independence to the candle here because, you know, I can use it for various purposes. It, you know, functionally for me is only one candle. But if we didn't look at it from a human perspective, but we tried to look at it at a metaphysical level, to try to understand what it is at the most fundamental level, right? Then what Leibniz is going to say is that the candle is an appearance, that it's a way that a bunch of monads show up to us in a certain physical form. And why can they show up to us in that way? Because we have a certain kind of a perceptual apparatus that can see objects or, you know, smell objects and so on of a certain size, right? And so Leibniz isn't denying that candles actually exist. He's just denying that candles form, you know, that candles or really any kind of body form the fundamental or ultimate kind of reality. Why? Because they have to be composed of things that are even further composed of things, etc., 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 such that seeing them as one unified thing only occurs because of certain features about us, certain features about human beings, but it doesn't describe fundamental reality. So for Leibniz, the most fundamental reality is monads and their perceptions, and bodies are merely ways that monads appear to each other, right? Ways that the universe appears, ways that we understand certain phenomena. Now you might think, okay, well, Leibniz might have just created more problems than he actually has the ability to solve. Yeah, that's probably true. But I think that we can try to reconstruct his philosophy as concretely as possible, try to get like a really solid picture of what's going on. So we're going to do that a little bit more in the next part of the video. But these are two objections to Descartes' notion of extended substance, that extended things, bodies, can't really be substances because they're not a fundamental kind of reality at all. They're always composed of monads that have an infinitesimally small magnitude, and that they only appear in certain shapes, right, in certain bodies, as a result of features about themselves and their perceptions, right? That bodies do not form an ultimate form of reality in the same way that monads do. Okay, now here quickly is one argument for why Cartesian interactionism must be false. So Cartesian interactionism says that involuntary actions, so whenever you decide, like, I'm going to go to the kitchen, what happens is the mind imparts a causal force through the pineal gland in the body, and that makes your body move, right? Now, Descartes had already discovered in his own physical inquiries that to do physics, that there has to be a conservation of matter and energy. And this is why Descartes, in his own physical investigation, says that the total quantity of force in the universe is constant. And similarly, Leibniz will use this as an argument against the notion of Cartesian interactionism. Why? Because as an essential part of Descartes' picture of how this works is that an immaterial substance, a mind, imparts causal force onto a physical substance, a body. So consider that, right? So like, you can describe the brain as a physical system, right? And so you can, but in order to do that, you have to conceive of this physical system as having a constant amount of kinetic energy, right? But if the mind can sort of enter in an incorporeal way and determine certain features of a body, then you have the introduction of causal force into a physical system, right? From, an immaterial system to a physical one. And that seems to violate all of the known mechanics about how bodies operate, right? And so part of Leibniz's argument against Descartes' picture of extended substances is that he didn't really have a very rigorously scientific one. That he didn't think really about the composition of extended substances. He didn't really think about the implications of the extended substances being mathematically understandable and so composed of an infinite number of points, right? And he didn't consider the fact that he introduces a kind of mysterious causal force from a mental sphere to a physical one. And so these are the problems with that Leibniz finds with Descartes' system. The next video is going to focus on Leibniz's own system that he uses instead.